Hi, I'm Josh from Workflow Power. Today we're going to run through building out a travel solution in Monday.com. This solution covers three workflow types that you can apply in your account to build out a system that can manage contact suppliers, summarizing your trips, managing itineraries, and delivering the services to your clients. This workflow solution is available as an installable link. You can access it via the description below this video. You'll be able to install this full solution covering the entire structure, the automations, and documentation on how to customize it. Now today we're really going to focus on what's the right structure, how to build it, and I'm going to take you through each individual step to ensure that you can create this solution or customize it in a way that makes sense for your travel business. So let's get into looking at our workspace. The first thing that we would do inside our workspace is create some folders. So you can see here we've created our CRM Lite folder. Again, if you know a little bit about Monday, you know that Monday has a CRM, so you could incorporate the CRM component into this flow as well. And we have a dedicated CRM solution for travel as well that you can access. Now you can see the other folders we've created. We've created a Lite option 1. Now the reason behind these different workflow options is to enable things around scale, capability of plan, and ensuring that you can manage the different solutions or options based on the size of your business, what type of plan you're using on Monday, and what features you need to access. So we've got our CRM Lite folder, our Lite management option 1, static boards option 2, dynamic boards option 3, and then obviously templates and some reporting as well that we can create. Now after you have your workflow space established, you've created some folders to segment out or organize that workspace. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through and create our CRM Lite board structure. Now inside the CRM Lite folder, what we're going to focus on is creating a contact board for contact management. Now those contacts could be both participants or clients that you're accessing in planning those trips, or they could be contacts related to your suppliers. And then we're going to create a suppliers board. Now inside each of these, we're going to ensure that we have the basic functionality and structure that can enable us to manage contacts, manage suppliers, and then also link these down to our workflows. So it's going to be a really critical structure step that we're focusing on. So you can see in the contacts board here, going through creating some standard data around email, phone, contact type. This is where we can differentiate what type of contact it is, if it's a supplier or a client. And we're going to build that out really simply. Next to our suppliers, we're also going to go through and create a similar structure, but there we're focusing more on that business level supplier that may be feeding into our trip planning or our itineraries or things we want to create. Now, once we have our sample structure in, the first thing we're then going to do is we're just going to put in some dummy data. So we're just going to put in a couple of records with an email, a phone. We're going to identify what type of client it is, whether it's an actual supplier or it's a client. And then we're going to go down and do a similar thing for our suppliers. So you can see here we're adding a few records in. Again, you can mix it up between supplier and client, and that's kind of really what we're focusing on here. Now, once we've got this information in, we've got our basic structure set up for our contacts. We're then going to look at our suppliers and what type of structure we would want to create inside here. Now with your suppliers, this is where you can start to add more additional information. You can start to think about the type of services that they provide. You can start to think about addresses, maybe information you want to pull in against like events or things you're planning against those trips. To seamlessly kind of show that data. So you can see here we're creating a, potentially a business or a type of business. We'll give it an address. We'll identify what service it relates to. We might have a phone number and all that kind of information as well. Now, what we can also do is obviously in here, we could create dedicated views. So we could split off a view inside our suppliers by creating a new view. We could call it, say, accommodation. This lets us hold one structure board to hold all the information, but then filter out the information. So we're just going to go in here and we're going to say, we just want to see anyone who's supplying accommodation. So we can have our, obviously our all view. We can then have our board that represents our different suppliers. Now the next thing that we would do is we want to connect those two together. So we'd add a column here and we call it a connect boards column. And what we're going to do is we're going to select our contacts board. We're going to create a two-way connection. So we're going to ensure that one, that column lives in this board, but it also lives in the other board as well. So over here in our contacts board, we'll rename this to call it suppliers. And then we've got this supplier here, Sarah. Let's link her to that Grand Hotel Group. So now in our suppliers view, we can see that we have Sarah linked to this Grand Hotel Group, and we know we can have multiple people. Maybe we want to mirror in some information. So here we can customize this and add a mirror column. And maybe we want to show email address. So we want to show contact email address. So this lets us obviously have one dedicated spot for all our suppliers, but we can differentiate the information that we want to show based on our different view types. So over in accommodation, for example, maybe we want to hide specific information. Maybe we don't need the address for some reason and we hide it so we can show different data across those different views in one board. So now we've got our suppliers set up, we've got our contacts set up. Our next step is to go through now down into our different workflow options, and we're going to look at our option 1, which covers more of a light structure. So this is really useful for those smaller type travel organizations that are really looking for something lean that can connect down into their contacts and suppliers, but not be too heavy from a management perspective. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go down and we're going to create a board called trips, and then we're going to push this up into our light management option here, and then we're going to open it up. Now once you've got this trips board created, our next plan structure-wise is to focus on the groups. Now the groups in this board are going to represent potentially different stages that you go through when executing the work. They could also essentially be anything you want. So you could be like the type of trip, it could be who's responsible for it, it could be really anything to make sense for your particular workflow. Now you can see here as we reorganize these groups, let's give it some different colors as well, and then we can rename it like this. Now what we'd want to do here is look at, okay, well, within our board, let's start adding some key data at the item level. So we want to add things like who's responsible for it, who's the lead, what's the travel dates or the things that are happening based on the period of time they're going to be traveling. Maybe we've got a budget, maybe we've got things around like files we need to collect for that particular trip, or can be retained at this high level within this board. Now, you can see there's a difference obviously between the dates we're traveling, but then also when our task schedules are. So while we might be traveling through here, our actual things that we execute to deliver the trip might be happening outside of those ranges when we're looking at it. So you can see here, maybe we have a budget to demonstrate some information. We also identified the trip at the item level. We represent the status. And then at the sub item level, this is where we're starting to show more of that data that would become all the tasks that we need to execute to manage this trip. Now, once we have this set up, there's a couple of things we might want to do. We might want to manage, particular columns down at that level. So what happens at the sub item level? What columns do we track down there? And then how do we pull and ladder that data up into the item level, kind of see all the information that we want to see that's applicable. So we can do things in here like track the status, obviously the due date of tasks, all the different things that are happening down at our sub item level. Now this gives us a few things. If we're on a lower level plan in Monday, this gives us one central spot to organize and track everything. You can keep it really simple, contained, and organized, where you're not doing a huge volume of trips with multiple people collaborating on delivery. This becomes a really kind of useful structure as we create a few more extra sub items here. Now, I think this structure, while useful at that really simple level, sometimes can be might not scale out as much, where you have lots of competing tasks or different things happening, where you need more specific information related to it. It's where you might try option 2 or option 3 that we'll walk through. One thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to connect now this to our suppliers board that we just created before. So maybe down at this planning task level, I want to see what supplier is going to deliver the services for that particular task or that day or that event that we're looking at. So here again, I'm going to use a connect boards column. I'm going to select this board. I'm going to connect it to my suppliers, and I'm going to create a two-way connection. And now that's lets me pull in like what supplier is relevant for that particular event or task that we're tracking on that trip for that client. So down in my suppliers board here, let's call this trips 1, this new column that's been created here. This is so we can start to see, well, what are our suppliers active on for those particular trips that we're planning? And it gives you a good count to see, for example, how many trips or events have we booked with this particular provider? Who's our top provider? All that information allows you to do that by enabling that connectivity. So you can see here as we go through, we'll create a few more details. What we've done is maybe tracking status. We've got due date here that would represent different information. They've got our supplier availability. So let's say potentially we loop in a supplier here. That is going to be this Grand Hotel Group. Maybe we also want to mirror in. So let's mirror in from that board, maybe we want to mirror in who the contact is. So who's the primary contact? And then maybe we also want to mirror in their email address. Maybe we want to mirror in the phone number. So let's mirror in, customize this, and let's choose the phone number, for example. Or the email address. So now we can see, for example, maybe we're awaiting confirmation on this supplier here. We can see that also at the supplier's level, what trip they're linked to or what activity, whether it's one or multiple. We can start to see dates down at this level really easily. So we can see that we have this booked in here on this particular date. We could visualize that up in a calendar. All different ways you could kind of see that information. So you can see here, maybe we create a calendar that represents, so let's create a calendar, and this represents maybe just our travel dates. So we don't want to show the task schedule, but we want to show travel dates. We want to color it by status, and then we can see all that information on our travel calendar, depending on when our dates are set. So let's say we push this forward, it's in 2024, so we went to 2024, we can see our travel dates here overlaid on our calendar. We could also put that in potentially, while it isn't a traditional calendar, it can be easier to visualize in a timeline. So we're going to kind of dock this widget, and then maybe we show the travel dates and we group by I'm just going to group it by group. And so we can see what we're planning and what's active. We go here, we can see it overlaid here where our particular trips are based on where they sit within our workflow. Now it's good visualization of that data all within a single board. Let's move this group up here so it's now active next to planning. Obviously we can then also in this view ladder up information. So for example, we've got progress here. Let's make sure our progress is attached to status. Let's make it 100%. And then we can ladder this progress up to show what's happening down at this level. So let's say travel progress. Now this can be used both from a planning perspective, but then also for tracking trips that are live and the tasks that are happening. Maybe you build out the plan. That plan then becomes something that's active and an itinerary that you track or need to provide support on based on what you're planning at that top level. So that light option structure 1 is really designed to give you a really simple intro into managing a travel workflow in Monday. If you're looking for greater scale, more details, we can then also look to do this at a more expanded level. And this is where we would focus on potentially looking at our option 2 and option 3 structures, where we can have a little bit more information or detail that we want to pull out for our particular kind of clients or our trips that we're planning. So in this example, we're going to go and we're going to look at, first we want to maybe come back while we go through and we'll create our trip summary and our trip types here. Important to note, inside our contacts, we can also link this to our, we can link this board to our trips really easily. So let's say we want to see what contact this trip is planned for. We can go to our contacts board and we can connect this board again to our trips. So let's say we want to create a two-way connection here. And I'll say what contact or what client is related to what trip. I can also see it in here. So who are the contacts on this trip? And let's say for this African one, we've got John and we've got Mike. So we can see that they're the contacts linked to it. If we wanted to report on like, how many trips have we done for these clients? Or do we want to upsell them? We can see all that really easily in here. Now, as we move on to option 2, we're going to focus on our trip summary, which is very similar to our trips view. And then what we're going to focus on is the ability to have one dedicated board that has groups that will hold the itineraries or the tasks for those trips. So as we go to our trip summary 2, we can see that we're building out a very similar structure and an approach to manage our itineraries. So we can see here that we've got obviously our planning phase, we've got active, completed, and then post-trip. So let's give these some different colors. This is very similar to our trips that we've looked at. So a very good example of like a zoomed out high level master view of what all our trips are doing. Again, we can have our dates, our schedule, our files, and our budget in here as well. The main difference with this structure is, again, we're looking at, now we have different types of trips. So potentially you have like a region that you do trips to or a type of itinerary. Maybe they sit in their own dedicated board. So this trip type A might be trips to an overseas location, for example. It may be a particular region. It may be a particular type of itinerary. In this example, we're getting more detailed in how we want to list out what that itinerary looks like, how it's going to then be tracked by the team, and then how that's going to connect up to our trip summary as well. So we can see that the first thing that we want to focus on is going back to our trip summary, and we would again focus on, well, who's the contact here? So we can connect it to our contacts. So I can connect this to our contacts, create a two-way connection. And now this is our contacts who are related to this trip. Right back up in here, we've got, we just call this trips, and this is option 2. Again, if you're following along and you've got, oh, I know the solution that I want, this workflow structure makes sense for me, you would ignore the other options and just build out specifically to that way of working. You wouldn't need to create the other 2 options if you're going with option 1. Now, once we have our contact link, we would also potentially want to now go down and look at our trip and how we're going to structure it. Now, this is where, again, I touched on, you can get much more detailed in terms of what this structure looks like. This is where you can start to build out a template approach of how you want to structure this and what makes sense to build this in the most efficient way. Once we've got this structure set up, the main things I want to focus on is the template. So you'll see we have obviously some blank groups here that would represent different trips. So these are our planned travel itineraries for different clients. The benefit of this is that you contain it within a single board. So you've got that board to capture all that information for all the trips that you're managing. We build out another group that holds a template structure. So you can see here, we can have what event is applicable for particular days on that itinerary. We can have sub items that track different things underneath that. And this is where we're going to start to connect in. So we're going to go connect boards. Firstly, we're going to connect it to our trip summary. So we're going to create a two-way connection up there so we can pull information from what's happening in here up into our summary view. The next thing we're going to do is we want to do that similar thing that we did before, and we're going to connect our suppliers. So maybe we want to connect what suppliers are related to what events or activities on each day. So this is where I can get really granular. So I'm going to click on my suppliers button. I'm going to create a two-way connection. And then once I connect these, I can see now I can link in suppliers as well as show them back in here. So we're going to call this trips 2. Now, down in this board, what I would then focus on doing is structuring this in a way that makes sense. So I'd create one table here and I'd rename it. I'm going to call this the template. And I'm going to filter this by, I just want to show my template group, and I'm going to save it. Now, once I've got that template set up, maybe I just want to see one that's all trips. So I'm going to create one that's, rename it, and I'm going to say all trips. I'm going to pin this as the default. So this becomes my default. And I'm going to switch to my advanced filters here. I'm going to say where the group is not the auto trigger or the type A. So that should show us all our trips as tasks start to drop into them. So say, for example, this is event A. Over in our all trips view, when we create it, they will show in this all view. So we'll be able to see a summary of all our trips and what's happening really easily. Now, there's a couple of things. Obviously, you need to work on the template. What's the right structure? What makes sense is you repeat this over and over again. And then we're going to work on simple automations. You can access all the automations as part of the installable solution. We say this is our trip type activity. And then from here, we want to mirror it into information. So maybe like before, we were summarizing it at the sub item level. In this example, we just want to show it at a progress level to see like what's the progress of all the tasks or the things that we're ticking off or the things that we're tracking for this particular client. Now, what I want to do now is I want to set up a really simple automation that lets me utilize that template structure. So I'm going to say in here, when status changes to active, we want to create an item over in that trips trip type A. So I'm going to create it there. And where we want to create it is in the auto trigger group. So I'm only going to map across the name because really what it does is it just creates a trigger point for us to duplicate that group of template tasks and create something new from it. So down in here, what we're going to say now is we're going to add an automation in this board, and we're going to say when item is created and when it's in this group. We're going to say when it's in auto trigger, we're going to duplicate a group. So we're going to duplicate our template group. As simple as that. A very good structure that's underutilized is the ability to kind of really make this very simple. Have one board or a couple of boards that manage your trip types. Have your master overview planned. And this is where you can start to say, I have trip X. And we're going to say, it might be this itinerary. We put it to active. Obviously, automations could move this down in our groups here. It's going to create a new item in here. So you can see that it's created trip X. And then what it's doing is it's duplicating now that template. So we can rename this group trip X. We can see now if we refresh this, that what's happening is the automation's gone, okay, well, that's the template that I want. Let's duplicate it and let's create a new group or trip or list of activities based on that. I can then take that a little bit further. I can create a new table in here. I can rename this. I can call it trip X. I can then filter. So let's go back to our advanced filters and let's say where group is trip X. Let's save it, but then let's also get a little bit more granular and let's group it by the days, the stages. So now we're showing day 1, day 2 in a logical broken down format. Really easy to see. I can flick between all trips. Maybe I want to see a summary here so I can have my trips closed up and see exactly what's happening, and then go to my broken out expanded view based on day. And that will let me see exactly what's happening across that particular trip. Now, once we have this information here, we can then connect it. So I can select all the tasks in there. I can select my trip summary, say trip X. It's going to summarize that information up to there. I can pull in my suppliers based on the different activities they're providing here. And again, mirror in information that I need to see here. And you're effectively building out that itinerary and those tasks that you need to track and execute. Back in my summary, I can now see the information that's synced and any summarized data as well across all those activities that we're tracking. Again, you could go down, you could create a few of these template types, depending if there's different trips or different itineraries, your structure, where you want those same grouped things to live together. So it's not just one board, you could have a few to scale out this structure really easily. Now, the final solution that we're going to look at is typically the most common. You can run into, I guess, some challenges when you look at potentially what plan you're on with Monday. How is this going to figure into that? What limitations will you run into where you have a board for every trip type? Again, not huge issues if you're not connecting data up. So for example, in your high level summary, if you don't want to see what information is happening at that summarized view, you can use this approach to have a more detailed view of every kind of trip that you're working on. The ability to template things up and organize them. This can be a much kind of simpler way to do it. Now you can see here what I'm focusing on is very similar start structure. So I personally always think the zoomed out kind of master overview is really useful. One, for a workflow initiation perspective, like you can run automations and triggers from it for those things that happen down below. But also just to reduce that overwhelm and get that big picture. Like what, if I've got 10 travel itineraries that I'm working on across multiple suppliers and contacts. How do I just get a snapshot and really understand what's happening in an easy to digest way? So again, our starting point would be our summary board. So here we're creating our different groups. So our planning, our active, completed, and then post trip. And we can see now as we recolor these kind of groups, this is where we would be focusing on that high level master view. So down here, I would create my standard columns that would represent that high level information that I'd want to see and then visualize, adding things like budget, status, the travel dates, when our kind of task schedule is. So you can see here, I've got my Australia trip. I might have a Europe trip. So all of that kind of corresponds down. You can see these boards on the left, down with more project focused boards that let me individualize and separate the data out. Now this can be useful where, for example, you need to invite guests in, they need shareable access. This can be a more appropriate structure for that, where you need Gantt charts individualized to that project. Where you have really long trips or planning cycles, this structure where you have a dedicated board can be super useful. You can see the way that we've structured this is slightly different. So what we're popping in here is all our different days across that trip would represent our groups. Now again, there's multiple ways you could structure your travel itineraries or your planning that makes sense for your organization or your business. This isn't the defined way you have to do it. You could structure it in different ways depending on what you want to see. I think days is useful just to let you break up everything in detail, close and open things up to see where they're at. Just like before, we'd focus on here by adding our columns, the things that we want to track at this level, the date things are happening, timeline, where files are at, who's assigned to it, what's the status. If we want to create dependent workflows on different things happening based on our date changing, we can build all that into this really easily. We can then also obviously create different dedicated views in here. We could create a dedicated Gantt chart that shows us exactly what's happening based on the dates in that trip. We can do really anything that would make sense in terms of structure. Again, when utilizing this option, I would also always link everything back. So I'd go back up the hierarchy to link this into my contacts. So what contacts are on this trip? The same way, we've done before. We would find our contacts and we create a two-way connection there. Once we've got our contacts linked in, we can link in any contacts that are relevant for this trip. We can, in our contacts board here, we've got obviously trips 3, which would make sense. We've then got our suppliers that we want to link in, which we would do in our boards here. We might want to link in, again, what supplier is relevant to what. So I can go here and I can say our suppliers, we're going to create a two-way connection, and then we can pull in suppliers that are relevant for these particular events, and more so for tracking or showing specific information down in these project boards, and then reporting and summarizing it up. You can see here, this is obviously a really quick example of how you can structure this out. You could do the same again across multiple trip types. So we may want to create another trip type, build that out, and potentially structure it in a way that makes sense for that trip type. What's our next really strategic way that we want to go is by defining, well, what do these itineraries look like? Are they repeatable? Like we created a template group in our option 2, we can convert this into a template. So we could convert this now planned itinerary that we've got planned out. Maybe this applies to all of our trip types. This is our standard itinerary structure, or maybe we've got defined itineraries that move through, or maybe as your business evolves or grows, as you plan trips, you're like, yep, that's a template, and we can turn it into a template. So I'm going to just turn this into a template, and I'm going to duplicate this existing one. I'm just going to create a standard template, and then I'm going to call it my Australia trip travel template. So I'm going to create that template. That's obviously going to go down and save it in our template center. It's going to become reusable every time we kind of want to kick this process off. And then it's there available as we go through and start our planning, what that's going to look like. So now in my automations here, just like we did before, what I can do is I can say, okay, well, when something in my master overview goes to active, so let's say when status, or maybe let's put it to planning, we want to create a board from that template. So we're going to create a board. So we're going to look for it, and there's our template. We'll give it a name by mapping the name from the item into here, and then we'll figure out where we put it. We'll put it in our dynamic boards here. Click done. So what's that saying is, again, when I went back to talking about your workflow, where you want to think about structure and where things can happen, is also those like automation or initiation points that can reduce the manual data input, reduce the effort and the handling. So in this example, let's say we put Australia here to planning. It's going to go and run that automation. It's going to go, okay, well, I'm looking for that template board. I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to drop it in that folder there in the exact same structure that we've applied to that particular project there. And that gives you that starting point to then kick things off. So you can see that's inherited that structure. I've now got a connection automatically down in my suppliers. It's built in. All the data's there. Then I just really need to start using it and connecting it up into my trip here. After we've got this set up, again, we've got our suppliers linked in. Our other connection point would be back into that summary. So I'd want to say trip summary 3, create a connection. And then all we're doing is we're going through all our tasks here, and then we're connecting them up into our trip summary to that relevant item. That gives us that zoomed out summarized view. Here we can see our, we call it trip activities maybe. And again, we can mirror in information. So you can see all these three structures, while very similar, provide nuances in terms of like what is going to make sense for the way you want to work. And we call this progress status, what type of plan you're on, what type of scale your business works at, and how many people are inside it. All of these can be kind of really useful for that structure. Now, as we go down, you can see how we can apply this structure across, different types of workflows, different itineraries that we build out, depending on what makes sense. My recommendation with this approach would be to have one kind of base template that is essentially the structure that you would contain, that being the groups, the columns, any information in there that makes sense to be repeatable, and then add those details to different types. So maybe like we want an explorer trip that's local, or we want an international trip. Add those nuances and those details into different template types from that base. And that's going to give you really the capabilities to scale that out. Now, once you've got these kind of templates set up, your next final port of call is obviously the ability to then look at reporting. You can create dashboards and connect that data in. When you look at, depending on what plan type you're in, if you go with option 3, there'll be connection limits around what you can report on and show in that visualization. Given you're running multiple projects for different things, there are connection limits to be aware of. In your trip type A and trip type B, now static options, option 2, you'll overcome a lot of those connection limits because you'll be running less boards. as new travel things happen, there are new groups in those boards, so those dashboards will update automatically. And obviously option 1 is really easy to report on because you have a single board. Now, when we go through and kind of what this looks like solution-wise, you can access this entire solution covering the documentation, screen share videos, and the text information on how to customize it. You'll also get an AI kind of customizer guide and prompt that we use to kind of customize solutions and build them out depending on clients' requirements. And you can see you'll get this base foundation that we've run through, being our contacts, our suppliers, how you can set up different views and see that information, our trips level here, so we can see our trips that are going through these different stages, what client they're linked to, then demonstrating the different tasks underneath, what supplier and contact is linked to that, what's their availability, being able to go down to our static option 2 where we're running potentially like a travel calendar to see data there, potentially another one to visualize it on a timeline view, showing us how we can run different trips and the information that's contained there, using our templates to trigger that. We've got all our inbuilt automations. We have dashboards here that can show you different data based on all your trip events and what's happening this week to give you a really condensed view across all trips. Our option 3 with our summary and our ability to ladder that data up, and then obviously our dedicated kind of boards that would represent particular tasks or activities across there, our Gantt views, maybe we want to run a calendar, and then finally building out a template structure underneath, and then laddering that all up into specific reporting or visualization. Now again, this solution has the entire structure already set up. It contains already the pre-built automations of things that can happen based on different stages or different triggers or different actions within the workflow. Now this solution's fully installable, enables customization, and lets you build out a travel solution that makes sense for your business on Monday.com. So I'd love to hear your feedback. If you've been able to utilize this solution, apply some of the structure tips and build out something for your travel organization in Monday, love to hear your feedback. Thanks for your time and look forward to seeing what you've been able to build for your travel business on Monday.com.